The first light of morning settled quietly over the hills surrounding Asheville, North Carolina. It wasn't just any sunrise. It carried a kind of stillness that made the whole town feel like it was holding its breath. There was something in the air, as if the earth itself knew something was ending. Inside a modest workshop on the edge of town, Thomas Bennett stood alone. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled slightly as they moved across the old workbench, fingertips brushing over nicks and stains made over the years. Each mark told a story, every groove held a memory. He stopped in front of a half-carved panel resting on the back wall, the outline of a tree, unfinished, forgotten when he got the phone call last month about his daughter's school. He let out a slow breath, barely more than a whisper. They'll understand. He hoped they would. Selling the shop wasn't just parting with tools and lumber. It was letting go of a piece of himself, something inherited, something earned, all of it laid down for the sake of giving Clara and Lily a chance elsewhere. Outside, the yellow school van waited with its engine softly humming. Both girls sat by the window, their ponytails slightly crooked, backpacks too big for their small shoulders. They waved, smiling wide, excitement bubbling in their tiny faces. Thomas waved back, but his grin was pulled thin, eyes blinking fast, to hold back what was already rising. The van turned up the hill slowly, its tires crunching against gravel. And just then, the bell from St. Andrew's Church rang. The sound floated down the valley, not loud, but clear, like a song that forgot whether it was supposed to be happy or sad. People paused. Neighbors from across the street, some leaning against fences, some pretending to busy themselves, all watching. Some nodded at him with quiet respect. Others looked away, not knowing what to say. No one really understood what this morning meant. Not yet, anyway. They saw a man saying goodbye to a building. But in truth, Thomas was making a sacrifice that would echo through the years. Quietly, woven into the town's story. Whether spoken or not, such choices leave marks, sometimes deeper than carvings left on wood. In the wide halls of their new school in Chapel Hill, Clara and Lily Bennett moved through the days like explorers in a land both exciting and strange. Everything was different. The smell of chalk and polished floors, the steady rhythm of the class bell, the way people spoke so fast but seemed to listen just the same. They had never seen so many kids in one place. That first week, Clara, always the quiet one, found her joy in the library, a small corner filled with poetry books and warm light. She'd sit there and read quietly, while the other children came and went, smiling when someone stopped to ask what she was reading. Lily, on the other hand, dove into her sketchbooks with both feet. She carried them everywhere, pages full of windows, stairs, rooftops, bridges. She started drawing buildings not just from around the school, but from memory. Her dad's old workshop, the church on the hill, the plaza where the wood dust used to stick to their shoes. At night, under the small lamp in their new shared dorm room, the girls wrote letters home. They didn't send them often, not because they forgot, but because they wanted each one to be right. "We're learning so much, Dad," the last one read. "One day we'll come back and help make everything strong again. We'll make you proud." Thomas read each letter slowly, sometimes more than once. He kept them all inside a wooden box he had made years ago and never sold. The box sat by his bedside, and each day he added one little thing to it, a button Lily used as a pretend coin, a piece of ribbon Clara had tied around his wrist once when she thought she was a nurse. The box was small, but to him it held the weight of a mountain. Life in town moved on. On Sundays, Thomas set up a table in the plaza to sell small chairs and hand-fixed clocks. Folks stopped by, joked with him, thanked him. No one knew that. Every night, he ended the day the same way, sitting alone by the old photograph of his daughters, the one taken just before they left, holding on to all the words he never quite managed to send back. 25 years had passed since Clara and Lily climbed into the yellow van and waved goodbye through fogged-up windows. In that time, the town of Asheville had barely changed, but the people had. The hills still rolled over the edge of town like a blanket pulled up each night, and the old streets still held the same bends and cracks. But the silence that had once lived in the workshop was broken one sunny morning by the hum of two shiny black SUVs pulling up in front of what was once Thomas Bennett's beloved carpentry. Now, the old shop was a half-hearted tourist cafe, the Wood Grain Stop, with faded signage, overpriced muffins, and photos of rustic tools hung for decoration, none of which had ever touched wood. Clara and Lily stepped out. They stood taller now, heels clicking on the gravel. Sunglasses, neat hair, polished nails. Anyone watching might think they just got back from a gallery, opening in Charlotte, not from a long-anticipated trip home. They paused before the door. Nothing was said as they walked inside. Tomas was already waiting. Time had stretched across his shoulders and settled into the lines around his eyes. His hair had turned silver, but his hands still carried the marks of chisels and nails, skin rough at the edges. He looked up when the bell rang and stood, not sure whether to open his arms or just wait. His daughters hugged him, quick and polite. The kind of embrace meant more for keeping up appearances than for comforting anyone. They all smiled, but the smiles didn't last longer than a few seconds. Inside, the smell of espresso and wax polish clashed with the scent of sawdust that Tomas could still remember without trying. They sat by the window at the same spot where the old workbench used to be, the one he had built when the twins were too small to see over it. Then Clara opened her folder. We want to rebuild the workshop," she said, choosing her words carefully. Lily nodded, not speaking yet. "We've been working with a non-profit that funds small cultural centers. It could be something for the town, for your legacy." Tomas listened, surprised but quiet. Clara didn't look away, but her next sentence changed the feeling in the air. "But there's one condition," she said, and her voice suddenly felt heavier than the years themselves. Lily leaned forward, unrolling a crisp set of architectural plans across the table. Her voice was calm but firm, the kind she used in boardrooms and budget meetings. "This side here," she said, pointing to a clean stretch of white space drawn over the cafe's current back wall, "would become an open-air courtyard. To do it properly, we'd need to take down part of the old Collins house behind it. The structure is too close. It blocks light and limits access." Tomas glanced up from his untouched cup of coffee. The Collins house wasn't just any old building. It had stood on that corner longer than any of them had been alive. It had once belonged to Miss Abigail Collins, who taught piano to half the town's children and handed out cookies to the ones who couldn't pay. After she passed, the town petitioned to preserve the place. Now it held weekend baking classes and a small community library. People didn't just like the house. They depended on it, even if they didn't say it outright. Lily kept explaining, her hands moving smoothly as she spoke about sustainability, square footage, and how a modern design would inspire donors. She used phrases like optimizing community access and creating an immersive experience. But all Tomas could hear were the pauses in between, the parts no one dared to speak aloud. To build something new, they'd have to erase something familiar. He didn't answer right away. His eyes wandered to a crack in the wall above the window, where sunlight slipped through like an old memory. He could almost hear the voices of children who once ran through that street, muddy shoes and loud laughter, filling the space that now held quiet tourists and overpriced pastries. Clara noticed his silence. She tried to steer things gently, talking about honoring history through future use, blending tradition with purpose. But even her tone betrayed uncertainty. Between the sisters, an unspoken divide widened. Lily's push for progress, Clara's careful balance, and Tomas, caught in The middle, feeling more like a relic than a father. Later that night, back in his small, creaky house on the hill, Tomas sat by the cold fireplace, holding the latest copy of the design. The lines were clean, sure, but the feeling was hollow. He whispered to the photo frames on the shelf, "Did I make a mistake letting them go?" His voice barely rose above the wind outside. The walls stayed quiet. Tomas didn't argue anymore. He nodded at the right moments, smiled enough to keep the peace, and agreed to walk the site when asked. He watched as Lily marched across the gravel lot, tablet in hand, pointing here and tapping there, charting out lines only she could see. Her steps were confident, but she no longer looked at the wood under her feet or the curve of the hill where the old rainwater used to pool. It was like she had mapped everything on a screen and didn't need the land itself to speak anymore. Clara, meanwhile, stuck closer to her father. While Lily met with contractors and engineers, Clara visited the small junior high where she and Lily once learned long division and folded paper cranes. The rooms were smaller than she remembered, and the desks now had names she didn't recognize, scratched into their sides, but the same lunch lady waved from the kitchen, and the same pine trees lined the basketball court outside. She didn't know what to call the ache in her chest, but it came every day after those visits, just something she felt when she heard the soft way people said her name, like it was still part of this place. Back at the site, things moved fast. Trucks pulled in with steel beams and concrete pallets. Fences went up. Foundations were traced with orange spray paint. That's when the town really started to notice. Some of the younger folks gathered outside the cafe talking about job opportunities, and how it was about time Asheville got noticed for more than its fall leaves and antique barns. But others weren't so sure. The older folks didn't show up to argue. They just quietly stopped coming around. They sat longer on their porches, shook their heads when the wind carried the sound of electric saws. Some muttered about losing the last real touch of the past. Others just asked Tomas what he thought, and though he never gave a straight answer, they kept asking anyway. Every afternoon, Tomas found himself drifting back to the site. He'd watch the workers, nod politely, and step around the dirt piles, like someone searching for something he'd dropped long ago. Slowly, without saying it, he started feeling like a bridge, caught in the space between what had been and what might still be, wondering if there was a way both could still belong. The noise of jackhammers and backhoes had become part of the daily rhythm, echoing through the narrow streets of Asheville like a distant drumbeat. But one Tuesday morning, the usual rhythm broke. A few workers clearing debris along the east wall of the old workshop paused when they spotted something odd, bricks with a faint gap running between them. Curious, they chipped away at the mortar, revealing a narrow wooden panel, sealed tight, but clearly handmade. One of the younger guys gave it a soft knock, then wedged it open with a crowbar. Inside was a small, hidden compartment no bigger than a backpack. It held a bundle of cloth wrapped tight with twine. When they tugged it out and opened it on a makeshift table, a quiet rust spread across the site. Inside were several old notebooks, each one filled with careful handwriting, faded sketches, and detailed notes on carpentry techniques that hadn't been practiced in town for decades. One worker ran to find Tomas, who dropped everything to come look. The sun hit his shoulders just right as he ran his fingers over the first page. The handwriting hadn't changed. He knew it immediately. It was his grandfather's, Miguel Bennett, the man who taught him to listen to wood before shaping it, who used to hum old gospel tunes while smoothing out cedar. Tomas hadn't seen those notebooks since he was a boy, and now here they were, safe and dry after all these years, like they had just been waiting for the right time to return. The news spread quick. The older townsfolk came first, leaning on canes or folding chairs, pointing out words or symbols they remembered from their own childhoods. The younger ones followed, phones out, capturing pictures while asking Tomas to explain what a dovetail joint did, or why sugar maple was better than pine for certain tasks. That evening, Tomas laid the notebooks out carefully at the dinner table and called in Clara and Lily. His hands trembled slightly, more from hope than nerves. "Maybe," he said, looking from one daughter to the other, "we can rebuild something that remembers where it came from." Clara lit up instantly. "We could frame it around these sketches, blend in the designs but keep the heart." Lily frowned. "You want to turn the center into a museum?" "No," Tomas answered. "I want it to be alive, not just show tradition, carry it forward." Lily sat at a conference call table in the back room of a local hotel, her tablet propped up beside a half-empty coffee cup. The video feed from New York showed 3 investors from Franklin and Ward, the non-profit group backing the cultural center. Their suits were sharp, their voices clipped and practiced. They didn't care about forgotten notebooks or historic beams. They cared about deadlines. They wanted bold, modern design, a portfolio piece that would turn heads. She nodded at each, talking point, answering questions with the same steady rhythm she'd used for years. But something in her eyes flickered. Ever since returning to Asheville, that certainty she once felt had started to slip. She glanced toward the window, where the outline of the old Collins house still stood, and her jaw tightened. Back in New York, she made decisions like this every week, no hesitation. But that was different. That was the city. This was home, even if she didn't want to call it that. Later that afternoon, Clara was across town, sitting on a bench outside the library when she saw him. Ben Carter, the same Ben who used to wait outside the schoolhouse, with an extra sandwich, the same one who gave her wildflowers wrapped in notebook paper just before graduation. He walked slower now, with a slight limp, but his smile hadn't changed. He recognized her immediately. They talked for hours, slipping, back into a rhythm that felt oddly easy. Ben, now retired from 30 years of teaching science at the local high school, still had that spark, every sentence full of questions and half-remembered facts. He listened as Clara spoke about the education programs she'd helped run overseas, and then said gently, "Sounds like the kids here could use something like that too." That night, Clara sat on the porch steps beside her dad, watching the moon rise over the trees. What if part of the new center was a place where kids could come learn for free, she asked. Something with real lessons, grounded in what this town needs, not just what looks good in a brochure. Tomas looked at her for a long moment, then simply said, "Talk to your sister." But Clara hesitated. She knew Lily was still balancing expectations from people with way more money and way less patience. She wasn't sure if her idea would build a bridge between them or tear the last one down. The distance between Clara and Lily wasn't just emotional anymore. It was starting to get loud. Meetings turned into arguments, polite suggestions into sharp words. Clara kept pushing for a balance, trying to hold on to the idea that they could build something meaningful, something that truly belonged to Asheville. She brought up the notebooks again, showed mock-ups of classrooms and open workshops where kids could learn real things. She talked about community volunteers, free programs, and events that welcomed everyone. But Lily wasn't hearing it. She rolled out a sleek 3D rendering during one of their planning sessions, complete with minimalist walkways, flat rooftops, and the Collins house removed like it had never mattered. She called it efficient, future-ready. "Clean lines, natural flow of traffic," she said, pointing at the screen. "This is what donors want, not creaky doors and crooked porches." Clara stared at the model with tight lips, resisting the urge to slam the laptop shut. Tomas, watching from the back of the room, didn't say a word. His jaw clenched, but he held it in. That night, Tomas climbed the hill back to his place, slow but steady. The next morning, he didn't show up at the construction site. Instead, he stayed in the shed behind his house, brushing off piles of dust and clearing space with heavy steps. Bits of old cedar and oak, rescued over the years from torn-down barns and fallen trees, lined the corners of the room. He placed them on the workbench one by one. No blueprints, no 3D models, just memory and hands that still remembered how to shape something without a screen telling them what came next. He began shaping a bench. Not fancy, not perfect, but it had curves that cradled the back, smooth arms wide enough to rest a cup of coffee, and a seat deep enough to hold silence. He didn't ask if it would be used. He didn't wait for permission. Each morning he returned to it before the sun climbed over the ridge. Each cut, each sanding stroke, was like speaking a language he feared might disappear soon. "This," he muttered once, wiping sawdust from the edge, "this will be the center's heart, even if they never let it in." And with that, he kept carving, because the wood still listened, even if his daughters had forgotten how. Lily had been juggling too much for too long. Meetings with the board, calls from donors, endless projections and revised budgets. The investors were growing impatient. They wanted the project moving now, especially after she'd softened some of the original designs to include more of what Clara and their father had asked. Even those small concessions didn't sit well with the board, so she made a call, told the lead contractor to bring the machines in on Monday and begin site prep for the extension. No more delays. She didn't loop in her dad this time. Part of her thought she'd done him a favor by keeping him out of the conflict, but deep down, she knew she was crossing a line. That same morning, residents of Asheville noticed the noise. Bulldozers on the gravel path behind the old workshop, thick cables across the ground, and orange-vested workers positioning stakes near where the Collins house stood. A few people paused, unsure if there had been an announcement they missed. By mid-morning, it was clear that this wasn't part of the agreed timeline. Phones started ringing. Whispers turned into full conversations at the diner and gas station. Within an hour, someone knocked on Tomas's door at the edge of town. He opened it, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and the words hit him hard. "They're tearing into it already, now." Tomas didn't even grab his coat. He headed straight to the site with urgency in his step, moving faster than he had in months. The moment he set foot by the old stone walkway where Miguel Bennett had once carved initials into a fence post, he saw the machines, the workers, the heaps of timber, the past being erased without warning. He didn't shout. He stood in front of one of the machines and raised a hand. "Stop this now," he said, quiet but sure. "You don't build here if you don't respect what came before." The workers hesitated. Eyes drifted between one another, unsure. No one wanted to be the one to keep going. Then something happened Tomas hadn't expected. A few neighbors walked up beside him, then a few more. Eventually, 24 people formed a loose line across the site, arms folded and faces steady. They didn't yell. They stood. The project had begun, but not the way Lily planned. A simple stand had turned into something bigger, a reckoning, wrapped in plywood and memory. The tension that had been building between Clara and Lily finally boiled over in the school auditorium, where the town council had agreed to hold a public forum. The place was packed. Some folks sat with arms crossed, others leaned forward like they expected a fight. And they weren't wrong. Clara stood by a poster showing a sketch of her proposal, a free neighborhood school built beside the workshop. Lily stood less than 20 feet away, flanked by 2 local business leaders and a scaled-down model of her modern expansion. The air felt tight, like people were holding their breath. Clara spoke first, listing ideas shared by teachers, parents, volunteers, how the center could be a space for the kids and elders alike, a blend of craft and learning. She wasn't trying to win, just asking to be heard. But before she could finish, Lily cut in. "You think these dreams are built with intentions, Clara?" she snapped, arms locking at her sides. "They're built with money, timelines, structure." Clara took a long breath, trying to stay calm. "This is where we grew up, Lily. It's not just numbers and renderings to us." That's when it happened. Lily's mask fell. Her voice rose, raw and sharp. "I fought to survive outside this town. I had to become someone else to be taken seriously. I thought maybe he sent us away because keeping us close would have meant holding on to his small world." The words stunned the room, but none more than Tomas, who had been standing by the back wall. Something in his chest gave way then, not all at once but piece by piece, like a house too soaked by rain to hold. He made his way forward slowly, eyes never leaving his daughter's. He didn't argue, barely spoke, only said, Every night I fell asleep next to your pictures. I wasn't trying to push you away. I just thought maybe you'd have a better shot if you left." His hand trembled as he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulling out an old photo of the two girls dressed for a school play. "I'm sorry I gave so little, but I never gave up loving you." It didn't fix everything, but in that second, the room exhaled, and Lily looked at her father, not like a man who failed, but a man who hurt quietly and deeply all this time. The room had emptied slowly after the confrontation. No more shouting, no more eager investors or neighbors, demanding answers, just low murmurs and dragging steps across the wooden floor. That night, Lily didn't say much. She walked back to the house alone, barely speaking to Clara, who stayed behind with their father. Her chest felt tight as she tried to take in what he'd said. The image of him sleeping near their photos cracked something open inside her, and for once she couldn't respond with a tidy solution or a polished sentence. She just didn't have the words. Later, while the town drifted into evening routines, Tomas made his way down the hill toward the square. No announcement, no microphone, just a steady walk, one foot after the other, like he knew this quiet moment had waited for a long time. The plaza lights flickered on as he reached the old stone bench near the community board. A few people noticed him and paused. Then a few more. Slowly, a small circle formed just to listen, even if no one knew quite what for. Tomas looked around, eyes catching familiar faces. He took a folded stack of envelopes from his coat and held them loosely in one hand. "I've kept these for years," he said, voice steady but low. "Letters I wrote but never sent, mostly to Clara and Lily. Some are just pieces of wood, sketches, plans, dreams, but they were all I could give at the time." He gave a quiet laugh, almost to himself. "I sold the workshop not because I stopped caring, but because I couldn't fight to keep it while watching the town crumble around it. I thought if I let go, it might be easier for everyone. But I was wrong. Letting go didn't fix anything. It just left a hole." Clara stood silently near the back, her eyes full. She didn't try to stop the tears this time. Ben stood by her side, hand gently wrapping around hers, grounding her even as her heart pulled both forward and back. There were no gasps, no grand applause, just silence. The kind people offer when something difficult and true rises in front of them. By the end, it was clear to everyone across the plaza. This wasn't about winning. It wasn't about who made better choices. It was about three people, tangled by time and regret, trying to find their way back home. And as the crowd slowly stepped forward, understanding moved through the square like air after a storm, heavy and clear. The morning after his quiet confession in the town square, Tomas arrived early at the temporary trailer they'd been using as the project headquarters. He opened the doors wide, letting in the cool North Carolina air, and began setting out folding chairs. By 9, people started showing up, some with toolboxes, others just curious. Clara came with a satchel stuffed full of the old notebooks, and Lily arrived last, silent but present, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorframe. Tomas stepped forward and cleared his throat. His eyes held that worn brightness, the kind that flickers between hope and nerves. He looked around at the faces gathered, neighbors, former students, retired carpenters, local teenagers who remembered the stories even if they'd never seen the shop as it was. Then he raised a bundle of papers, pages copied from Rosa's notebooks, and laid them gently on the table. "I've got something for us. An idea that might sound crazy," he said. "We rebuild the workshop, old ways, no shortcuts, just like Rosa wrote it, and we do it in 3 weeks." He paused, giving the weight of that sentence time to land. "If we finish on time, the land will stay with the town. No outside contracts, no glossy redesigns, just ours." Lily raised an eyebrow. 3 weeks? With volunteers? You know this isn't a movie, right? Her voice wasn't cold, but it carried all the doubt of someone who'd spent too long working in places where nothing happened without paperwork and permits. But Clara stepped beside their father, her voice steady. "It's not about perfect, it's about real, and folks here know how to build something when it matters." The room stirred. An old mechanic named Harold raised his hand and said, "I still got my joiner buried under the shed, been waiting for a reason to dust it off." Laughter followed. By noon, a chalkboard listed over 30 names, some penciled in by shaky hands, others in confident print. Saws were found, hammers passed between young and old. Rosa's steps, once sketched in pencil decades ago, found new strength in every nail, board, and calloused palm. Lily didn't say yes, but she didn't walk away either. She just stood there watching something bigger than deadlines take shape, one plank at a time. Tomas picked up his old mallet like it had always been there, waiting for his grip to return. It felt heavier than before, but familiar. When he stepped into the frame of the structure rising from the red clay, the others went quiet, not out of formality, but respect. He nodded, then raised the first beam with 2 others bookmarking each end. One tap, then another. Each strike sank deep into the joints, carried by muscle memory and purpose that didn't need measuring tape. By the second day, he'd become the teacher again, explaining angles, sharpening chisels, correcting grip without embarrassment. Every cut had meaning, not just in shape, but in shared experience. Teenagers who'd only ever watched how-to videos on their phones nudged closer, handing over tools to folks twice their age. 8-year-olds sat on milk crates beside their grandfathers, asking questions. Someone ran to jot down a story about how Rosa once wired her own light fixtures using parts from an old radio. Meanwhile, Clara kept the flow moving near the edge of the site, under a large canvas tent stretched between 2 poles. Her voice carried clearly over the sound of sanding and hammering. She pointed to chalk diagrams on an easel, speaking to small circles of kids and young adults about what a community school could really be. A place where learning didn't stop at the end of a standardized test. She shared lesson plans that included gardening, woodwork, storytelling, and math tied to daily life. A few retired teachers joined her, scribbling notes and laughing between practice lessons. Lily, always a few steps removed, had been watching from the wraparound porch of her inn. She carried a mug of coffee every morning and leaned against the railing, taking everything in. For the first few days, she said nothing. It was as if her body remembered the rhythm of the place, even before her mind gave in. She saw people moving, together like parts of a single engine, something working not because of deadlines, but because of belief in one another. She noticed how no one asked for titles or wanted recognition, and for the first time in a long stretch of years, she didn't try to take charge. She just let herself listen, quietly, to the rhythm of saws, of conversation, of memories, rebuilding something she'd nearly forgotten. It was just after lunch when Lily saw it. A woman, easily in her 80s, walking across the job site with a cloth bag over one shoulder. At first glance, Lily thought the woman was headed somewhere else, maybe just passing through. But then she watched her reach in, pull out a handful of nails, and pass them to two teens waiting near the tool shed. They nodded, thanked her, and kept working like it was the most natural thing in the world. A few steps away, Adam, a young architect from Charlotte, who'd only ever designed buildings behind a screen, was bent over a thick piece of oak. Tomas guided his hand gently, showing him how to start the cut without binding the blade. Adam laughed at his own awkwardness, but there was no judgment, just patience, passed down like a well-worn tool. For Lily, something shifted. It wasn't loud. It didn't burst or crash. It just pulled at her chest like a string finally tugging. Free. That night, when the site was empty and shadows stretched long across the ground, she walked back. She didn't tell anyone. She wasn't even sure why she went, only that she needed to see it for herself. The moon lit her path just enough. There, beneath the open shed roof, sat a half-finished bench. It looked simple, but strong. The wood still carried the smell of resin, and each joint had the care of someone who meant every movement. Lily stepped closer, tracing her fingers along the surface. That's when she saw the names, Rosa, Manuel, and others carved softly into the grain. With one look, she knew her father had made this, one careful inch at a time. She sat for a moment, palm still resting on the seat. He had built it without asking anything back, just love, pure and unspoken, traced in wood. Back at the inn, she switched on the lamp by the desk. The light hum was the only sound as she opened her laptop and started typing. The email was simple and direct. She was stepping down from her position at the foundation. She was pulling the sponsorship agreements. She'd explain it all later. For Dutkeern, now that was enough. In that small, still choice, she felt something inside her fold back toward where it started, a quiet peace in giving without expecting, returning to something she'd forgotten how to hold. The next morning, the job site was already buzzing by sunrise. Hammers tapped lightly, drills whirred now and then, and someone had started a pot of coffee that drifted its scent across the grass. No one expected anything out of the ordinary, which is why the sight of Lily walking down the hill caught everyone off guard. She wore a plain t-shirt, jeans, and had her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. No clipboard, no phone in hand. Just a quiet look on her face like she had made up her mind. At first, folks paused mid-task. A couple of younger volunteers looked at each other, unsure. Lily didn't say a word. She walked straight over to a half-prepped plank, picked up a sanding block and got to work. Her motions were awkward at first, more used to spreadsheets than sawdust, but she didn't let go. She just kept sanding, slow and steady. Tomas watched from across the lot. He didn't come over right away. His hands stilled around a wood clamp, but his eyes softened as he took her in. Clara was the first to move. She crossed over, brushing sweat from her forehead with one sleeve. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around Lily. There was no speech, just a strong, quiet hug. Then, as if nothing had ever kept them apart, the two started laughing when Lily nearly dropped the saw while trying to pass it back. Still, slippery, huh? Clara chuckled. Some things never change. By lunchtime, word had spread. The old firehouse-turned-temporary kitchen was full of people. Folding tables overflowed with cornbread, stewed greens, and pitchers of cold lemonade. Aunt Sylvia made her famous peach cobbler for the first time in 5 years. Men and women passed around food and stories like currency, each one rich with memory. Someone mentioned how Rosa used to sing when she worked, and suddenly a couple of voices started humming the old tune from her workshop days. No one led, but everyone followed. Laughter echoed between bites, the kind of laughter that only shows up once walls come down. And just like that, without needing ceremony or speeches, an unspoken truth settled over them all. They hadn't just rebuilt a workshop, they'd built something deeper, rooted in forgiveness, shaped by choice, held together by hands that finally reached for each other again. With just 5 days left until the big opening, the site had taken on a different kind of rhythm. The school tent, once just a white canopy tucked behind the workshop, now echoed with voices of actual students. Clara had managed to pull together 2 full groups of kids, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. It was nothing official yet, no school, district stamps or fancy paperwork, but it was real. They sat in circles, did crafts, read out loud under trees, even tried their hand at simple math with chalk on wood planks. No desks, just imagination. Ben was always there, even with his own responsibilities pulling at him. He showed up every morning like clockwork. He ran short reading circles, helped the kids stretch before little skits, and tossed in a few of his own stories, filled with adventure and goofy characters that had them rolling with laughter. Whenever Clara needed a breather, he was already there, waiting with snacks or water or just a quick smile. As they walked the narrow roads of the village during breaks, their arms sometimes brushed. They didn't say too much about it. They didn't have to. Their steps lined up naturally, like they were finishing a walk they started years earlier. Back at the workshop, Lily had taken on a new project. Quietly, without making a big deal of it, she spent nights carving a scale model of the village. She used thin pieces of pine and salvaged glass from old windows, mapping the streets, rebuilding memories with her own hands. She didn't try to redesign the town, she just gave space for everything. The historic Blackwell Bakery, the old church with uneven steps, the new benches under the big oak, each piece placed with care. It was the first thing she built with no spreadsheets, no approvals. Just thanks. When she finished, she wrapped the base in an old cloth and walked it over to Tomas. He was sitting outside the workshop, oiling the handles of a new set of hand tools. She didn't speak at first, just placed the model in front of him. His hands paused, then lifted the cloth gently. He took in every carved rooftop, every alley, every corner that mattered. His eyes grew glassy, and all he could do was nod. Without saying a word, he stood, walked inside, and set the model right near the entrance, where everyone could see it as they came in. A piece of the past, present, and everything they were building together. The morning of the ceremony arrived quietly, almost like the world itself was holding its breath. A light fog had settled over the hills of Asheville, soft and calm, giving everything a silvery glow. The renovated workshop stood tall in the early light, painted in deep moss green and warm brown, with hand-carved trim patterns inspired by Cherokee woodwork and old southern porches. It looked new, but not unfamiliar. It belonged. By noon, the old church bells at the top of the street began to ring, 3 strong chimes that echoed across the valley. Folks emerged from porches, trucks and sidewalks, gathering in small clusters around the entrance of the workshop. Some held hands. Others had cameras, but no one seemed rushed. They were waiting like you wait for something important, not just scheduled. Kids sat on the grass or swung their legs from the backs of benches. Aunt Sylvia passed out tiny bags of cornbread chips she'd made that morning, slipping them into open hands with her usual wink. Right at the heart of it all, just below the tool shed windows, stood the bench, the one Tomas had carved by hand, sealed with oil, names sanded softly into its frame. The late morning sun finally cut through the fog and landed directly on it, making the wood glow like it had stored the light of other days. Tomas stepped forward. He didn't say anything, just walked up with slow, steady steps. His boots kicked, a bit of gravel, and he held his hat in one hand. Behind him came Clara and Lily, one on each side but not flanking, just walking together like family. He sat without speaking, folding his hands in his lap. His eyes scanned the faces around him, old friends, students now grown, neighbors who used to think this corner would get swallowed by time. And then he looked at his daughters, both standing tall, not as visitors, but as parts of this place. Again, the breeze picked up slightly, stirring sawdust in the air. Tomas exhaled, not heavy, just full. For the first time, he saw everything come back together, not because it looked like before, but because it felt solid again. The wood, the people, even the silence, it was all still his, shared and steady. What had once cracked wide open now sat whole again, quiet, but still deeply alive. By late afternoon, the energy around the workshop had shifted. Local news crews showed up, some from Nashville, even one from a public broadcasting station that had been following small towns reviving old trades. Camera people moved carefully, trying not to interrupt, while interviews played out under the banner that Clara and a few volunteers had painted the night before. It read, "Built together, kept together," still smelled like paint. One crew interviewed Tomas under the cedar tree out back, while another followed Lily as she showed the model to a group of teachers from a nearby county. There was talk of this becoming an example for other rural places, how restoration wasn't just about buildings, but people. The cameras captured it all. The bench with carved names, the murals painted by school kids, even Aunt Sylvia's homemade pickle stand holding strong near the gate. But none of those things are what the neighbors would bring up later. What stuck? Most didn't happen on a screen. It happened behind the school tent, on a circle of old chairs and milk crates someone dragged out from the storage shed. There, without lights or notes, folks started talking. High schoolers practicing how to hold a hammer next to men who'd used one every day for 50 years. Clara's niece asked what a plane tool was, and Mr. Franklin, who built half the barns around the valley, told her how it could shave a board clean like butter if you held your hands steady. No one rushed through anything. No one cut stories short. The air felt like it was catching up on something it didn't want to forget again. Not long after, Clara stood beside the blackboard under the tent. She wasn't nervous. It was as if her heart had already stepped into the role a long time ago. The kids gathered up front, reading poems they wrote over the past few days. Some stumbled, some giggled, but each one got through their lines with heads held higher than before. When the last voice finished, the crowd clapped without needing to be asked. Children ran across the dusty yard, hand in hand, their laughter carrying past the garden rows. Ben stood at a distance, his hands in his pockets, just watching her. Their eyes met. He smiled a small, quiet smile, one meant only for her. Words didn't need to be spoken. They both understood something simple. Time can't be rewound, but it can be given back in pieces. You just have to choose the right ones. Life didn't slow down after the celebration. In fact, it seemed like the whole town found a new kind of rhythm, not faster, just clearer. Lily, now officially a licensed architect again, had stopped designing high-rise lobbies. These days, folks around Asheville called her by a new nickname, the Memory Architect. It started as a joke, but it stuck. She liked the sound of it. Most of her time went into leading restoration projects throughout the county, using her great-uncle Walt's old field notebooks as a guide. He'd been long gone, but his pages were filled with careful sketches, lumber types, and notes written in tight script about beam joints, hand-carved gutters, and how old pine shifts with the seasons. Instead of working alone, she built a team. Local engineers joined in, along with students from Appalachian State who were eager to learn about real-world builds. Lily made sure no one treated the old methods as relics. She pushed for a solid agreement with the American Preservation Society to introduce courses in traditional design at nearby architecture programs. The dream was simple. If people knew how to rebuild with history in mind, they might stop tearing it all down in the first place. Back at the workshop, Tomas had packed away his custom orders. No more market-bound chairs or table sets shipped out on flatbeds. What mattered now was teaching. He didn't speak in long lectures, and he never handed out rules. Instead, he waited for someone to sit beside him, curious. Once, a boy named Eli hovered near the workbench, wide-eyed but quiet. Tomas handed him a block of cedar and said, "Put your ear close." Eli looked confused but obeyed. After a moment, Tomas smiled and whispered, "The wood's always saying something. It's alive longer than you think. Just listen before you cut." From then on, kids kept showing up. Some after school, some on weekends, a few even skipping out on video games to learn how to hold a chisel. Tomas saw laughter more than instructions, heard questions that pulled pieces of himself back into shape. Years ago, he'd feared the future wouldn't know what to do with someone like him. Now, with each shared smile, he saw it differently. The future wasn't far away. It was already listening, steady and open, waiting to build from the inside out. As the sun started to slip behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, the light stretched long shadows across the yard. The clouds took on that golden-pink color you only see for a few short minutes, and the air turned cooler, quieter. Tomas stood just outside the doorway of the workshop. His boots settled firm in the gravel. From that spot, he could see everything. The fresh paint, the hand-finished trim, the worn path where kids had run all day. Nothing flashy, but it all breathed again, like it had been waiting a long time to feel useful. He held the hands of Clara and Lily, one on each side. The three of them stood there, saying nothing for a while. It wasn't silence because there was nothing to say. It was silence that said more than words could. No one was pretending anymore. The past wasn't erased, just stitched into something stronger. Clara and Lily weren't just visiting daughters or echoes of their childhood selves. They had come back by choice, not out of guilt, not out of duty, but because something deep told them there was still more to grow here. Tomas looked at them and felt the years. Every bit of joy, every mistake, every nail driven wrong before. It was driven right. He knew none of this had unfolded easily. There were days when words hurt more than silence, days when grief sat at the table and wouldn't leave. But somehow, through all that stretch of time, they had made it to this moment with open hearts. The building behind them was more than timber and nails. It was a patchwork of second chances, a place where old pains had found softer edges and sharp memories had lost some of their bite. It was proof that forgiveness didn't have to show up all at once. It could arrive in slivers, like light, filtering through the slats of an old roof. A soft laugh rang out from the yard. One of the kids chasing fireflies, probably. And then another voice chimed in. From the porch, someone started strumming a guitar, lazy and warm. Tomas squeezed their hands a little tighter. The story had never really been about the building. It was about the people who dared to rebuild with their own hands, who stayed when it would have been easier to leave, and who loved deeply enough to let the past meet the present without fear.